The key sat in a red coffee tin on my father's workbench for as long as I can remember. A plain brass key on a plain ring. No label. No tag. He kept it separate from his key ring, separate from the kitchen drawer where he kept the house spares. Just a brass key in a coffee tin with 3 old screws and a rubber washer. I asked him once what it opened. He smiled and said it was for the thing that mattered most. I was 11. I thought he was being poetic, he was being precise. He died on a Thursday in November, and by Friday morning my stepmother had cleared his bedroom safe. She took the will. She took the deed. She took 32 years of my mother's jewelry he had kept for me. She took everything she could carry, certain she had all of it. She did not know about the workbench. She did not know about the coffee tin. And she did not know what my father had said to his oldest friend 3 months before the end, that he had already taken care of it. That everything that mattered was exactly where he had left it, and that Renata would never think to look there. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where we spend our evenings with quiet people and the things they built before they left. If you have ever watched someone take what was not theirs while you were still standing at the graveside, this one is for you tonight. Stay close, because the part that turns this story is not the safe Renata found. It is the one she did not. And when that second safe opened, it did not just contain what my father had left behind. It contained proof of exactly how well he had known her. Hit subscribe, leave a word in the comments, and let us go back to the beginning. My father, Frank Oakes, built things for a living, which meant he understood that the difference between something that lasted and something that didn't was usually about what was underneath. He was a contractor in Millhaven, Ohio for 31 years. He built additions and porches and small commercial buildings in the counties around us. And he did it with the precision of someone who believed that a thing worth doing was worth measuring twice. His tools were organized the way surgeons organize instruments. His truck was always clean. His bids came in on time and close to the number because he understood that the most expensive thing in any construction project was a surprise. He was also the quietest man I have ever known. Not cold. Quiet. There is a difference. My father could sit next to you for an hour without saying a word and make you feel, somehow, that the hour had been well spent. He thought before he spoke. When he finally spoke, it was usually the thing that mattered. My mother died when I was 9. Breast cancer. Fast. And then faster. And then gone. My father spent 3 years alone after that, running the business and driving me to school and making the dinners that did not taste like hers, but that he made every single evening anyway, standing at the same stove. I watched him do it. He was the kind of man who showed up for the ordinary things even when they were hard, especially when they were hard. Because he believed showing up was the whole job. He met Renata when I was 12. She came to a neighborhood association meeting he always attended, because that was the kind of man he was. She was sharp and put together and she made him laugh, which I had not heard him do much in those 3 years, and I was 12 and I wanted him to be happy, so I told myself it was fine. That was the first of several things I told myself over the years that were not quite true. Renata had a son from her first marriage. Kyle was 4 years older than me, which meant by the time my father and Renata married, I was 14, and Kyle was 18 and already halfway out of the house. I did not dislike Kyle. He was not a bad person. He was simply a person who had been raised to believe that his mother's needs were the organizing principle of every room he walked into, and he had never learned to question it. He would believe whatever she told him. He would say whatever she needed said. That was simply how he was built. I left for college at 18 and built a life I was proud of. Physical therapy school in Cincinnati, 2 residencies, a practice I joined at 30 that worked with post-surgical patients and weekend athletes and older people relearning to walk after falls. I was good at it. I liked the specificity of it, the way a body either responds or it does not, and the quiet satisfaction of watching someone take a step they could not take the week before. I got an apartment and then a small house, and I drove back to Millhaven on holidays and sometimes just because I wanted to sit at my father's kitchen table. He had a workshop in the garage that was his whole domain. Nobody went in there without being invited. It smelled like sawdust and machine oil and the particular cold of a concrete floor in winter. He kept his plans on a drafting table in the corner and his tools on pegboard walls with outlines drawn around each one so he could see at a glance if something was missing. On the workbench, a long wooden bench he had built himself, with a solid maple top he had planed flat by hand, he kept a row of coffee tins along the back wall. Each one held something specific: small screws, electrical connectors, rubber washers, the hardware that matters when you need it and costs nothing to keep. I had spent hours in that workshop as a child. He would give me a small project while he worked on his own, and we would be in there together for an afternoon without any obligation to fill the silence. The red coffee tin had always been there. Third from the left, slightly dented on one side from a fall it had taken years ago. Inside, 3 old screws, a rubber washer, and a plain brass key on a plain ring. No label. I had asked him about the key once, when I was 11, because I was the kind of child who noticed details that did not fit the pattern. He looked at the tin, and then at me, and said, "That is for the thing that matters most." I accepted this answer the way you accept answers from parents when you are 11, which is to tuck it into the back of a drawer in your mind, and leave it there for the day you understand what it means. I became a person who kept that kind of drawer. That one I never emptied. The key stayed in the tin. The tin stayed on the bench. My father grew older, and the business grew quieter. 1 or 2 projects a year. The ones he chose carefully. The clients he trusted. His knees bothered him. He moved more slowly. He spent more time in the workshop building things for pleasure. A chair, a cabinet, a small table for a woman at church who had admired his work. That was the kind of man he was. He built things for people when he did not have to, because the building was the point. I did not know he was sick until he told me. He was the kind of man who handles logistics before he announces a situation, and so he had apparently done all of it. The doctors, the diagnosis, the decisions, before he called me to come and sit at his kitchen table. He said he had maybe a year if things went well, and that the doctors and he had talked it through, and that he wanted to spend that year doing exactly what he enjoyed and not in treatment that made every day feel like the disease. I sat across from him and understood that this was not a conversation I was being invited to change. I was being told so that I would know. So I could be there. I moved back to Millhaven. I took a position at the clinic 40 minutes away and rented a small house 10 minutes from his, and I drove over most mornings to have coffee before work. He was himself for the first several months, fully present, specific, interested in everything the way he had always been. We talked about everything and nothing. He went to the workshop some days and just sat in there without building anything, which I understood was its own kind of building. Renata was careful with me during those months. She made sure to be in the kitchen when I arrived and out of it before too long. She was performing what she thought of as grace, which is a different thing from having it. I was not there to evaluate Renata. I was there for my father, and for those months I let everything else fall away. He died on a Thursday morning in November with his hands still and the workshop light on in the garage, because he had asked me to leave it on the night before, and I had not wanted to ask why. My father's estate attorney called me the morning after the funeral. He said what he needed to say gently, the way attorneys learn to speak in the first 48 hours after a death, but the information underneath the gentleness was not gentle. He said that my father's estate included a primary will, executed 3 years prior, which had been located and was currently in the possession of Renata Oakes. He said it as though this were routine. He said the will left the family home, which my father had owned outright since 1989, to Renata as the surviving spouse, with a portion of a retirement account directed to me. I asked one question. I asked when the will had been located. He paused. He said it appeared that Renata had accessed the bedroom safe the evening of my father's death and had secured a number of documents, which she had since delivered to the estate attorney's office. The evening of his death. My father died on a Thursday morning. I was in the house for most of that day. I drove home at 9 that night because I needed to sleep and because there was nothing more any of us could do. Renata was still in the house. Kyle was there. I drove home telling myself that grief was not a competition and that whatever people did in the hours after a loss was their own business. I did not know, in that car, what was happening while I drove. I found out about the safe from Kyle the following week in what I believe he thought was a helpful conversation. He said his mother had just wanted to make sure all the important documents were secure. He said it with the particular confidence of someone who has received an explanation and accepted it without examining it, without asking what exactly might have been lost, or where the documents would have been going, if not retrieved at 10 o'clock the night of a man's death. The bedroom safe was a combination lock safe that had been in my parents' room since before I was born. My mother had kept her good jewelry there. After she died, my father had kept her jewelry there for me, her engagement ring, a strand of pearls her own father had given her, a small gold locket she had worn every day of her adult life. He kept the house documents there, and his will, and the kind of papers a careful man keeps in a fireproof box because he believes in being prepared. I had known the safe existed. I had not known the combination. Renata had known it for 8 years. I went to see her the week after the attorney's call. I went with no plan to fight. I went because I wanted to understand. I sat across from Renata in my father's kitchen, which already looked different, in small ways I noticed without being able to name, and I said as plainly as I could that the will had been explained to me, and I asked whether my mother's jewelry had been among the items in the safe. Renata folded her hands on the table. She was composed. She said there had been some costume jewelry in the safe, and that she had boxed it up for me, and I was welcome to collect it. She used the phrase, costume jewelry, with precision. My mother's engagement ring was in that safe. The pearls were in that safe. Neither of these things were costume jewelry, and Renata had been in this family for 16 years, and knew the difference. I said, Renata, those pieces belonged to my mother. She said she understood, and she wanted me to have the costume jewelry, as she had said. I said, is the ring in the box? She said she really didn't recall the specifics of every piece. She really didn't recall. I took the box she offered. It contained 3 brooches and a bracelet and a pair of clip earrings. The ring was not there. The pearls were not there. The locket was not there. I sat in my father's driveway with the box in my lap and understood that Renata had taken the things that were not hers, and she had decided that my grief and my unfamiliarity with what the law permitted were going to make it possible for her to keep them. She was not wrong about the law. The estate attorney confirmed it. Whatever had been in that safe was now in Renata's possession, and in the absence of documentation proving that specific items belonged to me, her claim as surviving spouse was difficult to challenge. She had the will. She had the deed. She had the papers and the jewelry and the years of access my father's love for her had made possible. And she had used all of it in the hours between his death and mourning. I drove home, and I sat at my kitchen table. I thought about my father's hands. The way they looked in those last weeks. Deliberate, careful, even when they were tired. I thought about the workshop. I thought about the coffee tin. I had not been able to go to the workshop since he died. It was his room, and it smelled like him, and I was not ready to be in a place where that smell existed without him in it. But I sat at my table, and I thought about a plain brass key. And a man who had said to an 11-year-old who asked what it opened, "It is for the thing that matters most." He was not a man who said things he did not mean. If you have ever stood somewhere after a loss and understood that someone has taken what was yours and you cannot yet prove it, leave a word below. One word. I read every one of them. Subscribe and stay close. Because what was in my father's workshop is what I need to tell you about, and the story does not end in that driveway. Back to it. The person who helped me find it was not an attorney. He was not a family member. He was a man named Walt Pruitt, who had been my father's business partner for 22 years before Walt retired, and my father continued alone. Walt was 74. He drove a truck that was older than I was, and he had the particular solidity of a man who had done physical work his whole life and never expected anything he had not earned. He had known my father since they were both young enough that old photographs of them together look like different people. He had been at the funeral in the second row, which was where he always sat, not at the front because he did not like to be at the front, but not at the back. Because he was not the kind of man who sat at the back either. He called me on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after the funeral. He said, "Delia, there is something I need to tell you that I should have said before now, and I am sorry for the delay." I said okay. He said, "Your father came to see me about 3 months ago. He told me he was dying. He told me he had made arrangements. And he told me there was something in the workshop he wanted you to have when the time came. He said you would know where to look." I said, "Walt, what did he put in the workshop?" He said, "That's between you and your father. He wanted it to come from him. He just asked me to make sure you knew to go looking." I sat with that. Then I said, "Walt, did he know? About Renata? About what she might do?" Walt was quiet for one beat longer than the question required. Then he said, "Your father was the most careful man I ever knew in my life. He didn't build things without thinking about how they'd hold up under pressure. That is all I'll say." I went to the workshop that afternoon. I had a key to the side door my father had given me years earlier. The workshop was cold and dark when I unlocked it, the November air held inside the concrete walls. I stood in the doorway before I went in, the drafting table in the corner, the pegboard walls, the long maple workbench with the smooth surface of 30 years of use, the coffee tins along the back wall. Third from the left, slightly dented. I took the red tin from the shelf and sat on the workshop stool and opened it. The 3 screws. The rubber washer. The plain brass key on the plain ring, exactly as it had always been. I held the key in my palm for a long time. I did not know immediately what it opened. I looked around the workshop for a lock I had not noticed before. I checked the shelving systematically. I checked behind the pegboard. I checked the cabinet under the bench. In the far corner of the workshop, behind a short wooden panel that appeared to be a fixed part of the base wall, the kind of detail you would not notice unless you were looking for it, there was a small dial safe. A gray metal box, mounted to the concrete wall on 2 heavy bolts. The kind of safe you install when you do not want it found. The key was not for the safe. The key was for the panel. The panel had a small keyhole I had taken for a decorative detail in the wood. I put the key in. I turned it. The panel swung open. The safe behind it had a combination dial. My father had left me the combination in the only place he knew I would always have it. The cover page of a field manual for structural framing he had given me when I was 20, and studying for a building mechanics course he had recommended. I had carried that book from apartment to apartment for 15 years because he had written something in it. A sentence I had read 100 times without knowing it was also a number. The sequence was embedded in the sentence. It was exactly the kind of thing he would do. The book was at home on my shelf. I locked the panel and drove home to get it, and drove back, and I stood in the workshop in the late afternoon and turned the dial to the sequence in my father's handwriting, and the safe opened. Inside, a manila envelope, sealed, labeled in his hand. A letter addressed to me. And a smaller envelope with Walt Pruitt's name on it, which I later learned was a short note thanking Walt for the friendship of 50 years. My father had included it deliberately. He had not forgotten Walt. I locked the panel and I drove home. I did not open anything that night. I made dinner, and I sat at the table and I thought about my father in that workshop. About him installing that safe with Walt's help, or maybe alone, the way he preferred to work. About him visiting an attorney while he was still strong enough to make the drive, and sitting down across from a desk and going through every item on the list with the same care he would have brought to a construction plan. about embedding a safe combination into the cover page of a book 15 years before he needed it to be found, knowing I would keep the book. Knowing I would recognize the sentence, knowing, because he had paid close attention to me for 30 years, that I would be ready when the time came. He had been precise. About everything. About this. I opened the letter in the morning, with coffee, in the quiet of my kitchen. It was 2 pages in his handwriting. I will not read all of it because it was written for me, and some things belong only to the person they were written for. I will tell you what I can. He said he was sorry for many things and proud of more. He said he had known for 2 years that the situation in the house was not what he had once believed it to be, and that he had taken steps, and that I should not worry about any of it. He said the house where I had grown up, where my mother had lived, where I had eaten every dinner of my childhood, was mine. It had always been meant to be mine. He had made sure of it. Walt knew the attorney's name. The attorney was expecting my call. And then, at the bottom of the second page, in the last paragraph, my father wrote, "Delia, I built things my whole life, and the best one was you. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you face to face that everything was taken care of. I didn't want you spending these last months worrying about it. I wanted you here, sitting with me the way you were. That was enough. That was the most important thing. The key was always on the bench." I called Gerald Foss the following morning. He had been in practice in Millhaven for 40 years and had known my father from the Civic League in the 1990s. He said, "Miss Oakes, I've been expecting your call. Your father prepared very carefully. He made an appointment 6 months before he died, and we spent 2 sessions going through everything. He left nothing to chance." The manila envelope contained a will dated 7 months prior to my father's death, witnessed by Gerald Foss and by Walt Pruitt, notarized, properly executed under Ohio law. It superseded the earlier will Renata had taken from the bedroom safe. The terms were specific and complete. The family home, which my father had owned outright since he purchased it in 1989, before Renata, before anyone. The house he had paid off himself and maintained by hand for 31 years, was placed in a revocable trust with me as sole beneficiary. His tools and equipment went to me. A savings account in the amount of $47,000 went to me. Renata received a sum of $38,000 and her personal property, which my father had defined in an attached list to prevent ambiguity, and 60 days of continued occupancy from the date the will entered probate, to allow her time to make arrangements. He had been precise about that too. Gerald filed the will with the probate court that same week. Renata continued to live in the house without knowing what had been filed, because that is how the process works. It moves at its own pace. I knew. Walt knew. Gerald knew. And I went to work every morning at the clinic and came home to my rented house, and I said nothing to anyone who might carry it back to her, because my father had not built things by announcing them before they were ready. He had taught me that. I had paid attention. What I did in those weeks was begin to understand the full shape of what he had left me. The house had been appraised before the will was prepared. As of 6 months prior, it had been valued at $284,000. The neighborhood had improved slowly over the years, the way good neighborhoods do. The house itself was in the condition you would expect of a structure maintained by a contractor who believed that every building he was responsible for deserved to be kept right. The roof was 7 years old. The exterior had been repainted 3 summers ago. The workshop was immaculate. The setback came through Renata's attorney. 2 weeks after Gerald filed the updated will, a contest was filed. The claim was that the later will had been executed under undue influence during a period of diminished capacity. It was a standard challenge. Gerald had anticipated it. He had a letter from my father's oncologist confirming that 6 months prior to death, Frank Oakes had been fully competent and in complete possession of his judgment. He also had documentation of a cognitive screening my father had proactively requested 3 weeks after signing the will, because he had known someone might challenge it, and he had been precise about closing that door too. The contest was filed in October. I learned about it on a Monday, and I spent that Monday seeing my patients and listening carefully and doing my job. Because I had learned from my father that you do not stop doing your work because someone has filed a paper. You let the papers do their work. That is what papers are for. It resolved in 6 weeks. Renata's attorney withdrew the contest after reviewing Gerald's documentation. I did not celebrate. I went to the workshop that evening and sat on the stool at the bench, and I was just there, in the place that smelled like him, and that was enough. Walt came by the following Sunday. No call ahead. He never called ahead. He drove up in the truck and knocked on the workshop door and came in and sat in the second chair my father had always kept for company. A plain wooden chair with a cushion tied to the seat that fit the corner of the workshop as though it had been made for it. We sat together for an hour. He said once, in the middle of the quiet, that Frank had asked him not to say anything until I had found it myself. He said Frank believed I needed to find it on my own terms to really have it. I told him that sounded like him. Walt said it sounded exactly like him. Before he left, Walt said one more thing. He said he knew what she was going to do. He had known for 2 years. He told me he wasn't angry about it, which I respected him for, because I was plenty angry on his behalf. But he said the thing that mattered was not stopping her from doing it. The thing that mattered was making sure it did not work. If you have ever been protected by someone who had already thought 3 steps ahead of the person trying to harm you, leave that in the comments. One word is enough. Subscribe and stay close. Because Renata is about to find out what was in that workshop, and what I say to her is the part I have been building toward. Now, back to it. Renata found out about the second will on a Thursday afternoon in December, when the probate court sent formal notice that the contest had been resolved and that the estate would proceed under the terms of the later will. She called me within the hour. I let it go to voicemail. She called 3 more times. I listened to the first one, which told me what I needed to know. And I did not listen to the others. The first voicemail said, "Delia, I don't know what you think you are doing. Your father would not have wanted this. Call me back immediately." Her voice was controlled in the way a voice is controlled when the person is working very hard to maintain the performance of control. There was something underneath it. Not grief. Something harder. Her attorney sent a letter to Gerald the following week. It was longer than the first one and less specific about its grounds, which Gerald said meant they were running out of arguments. Kyle sent me a card, handwritten, which surprised me because I had not expected effort. He said he knew things had gotten difficult and that he was not trying to take sides, but that he hoped I understood his mother was going through a very painful time and he hoped we could work it out as a family. He used the phrase as a family with the confidence of someone who had not thought very carefully about what that phrase required of him. I read the card twice. I put it in a drawer. The handwriting told me something about who he was underneath what he had been made into, and I was still deciding what to do with that. The 60-day notice from Gerald went to Renata on a Tuesday. It told her that under the terms of the trust, she had 60 days from that date to vacate the family home, and that all personal property not belonging to the estate should be removed by the end of that period, and that a list of estate items was attached and should be considered in her planning. Gerald had been careful about the list. It included my mother's engagement ring. It included the pearls. It included the gold locket, each item described with specificity, provenance, estimated value, previous owner. My father had listed them in an appendix to the will. He had known they would be needed. He had been precise. Renata arrived at my door on a Saturday. She did not call first. She drove the 40 minutes from Millhaven to my rented house and knocked on my door at 10 in the morning on a weekend, which is the kind of thing a person does when they have run out of other angles. I saw her car from the window before I answered. I stood in my kitchen and I thought about what my father had written in the letter. That the thing that mattered was not preventing Renata from being who she was, that the thing that mattered was making sure who she was could not reach me. I thought about the house. I thought about 60 days. I opened the door. She looked smaller than she had at the funeral. People who are used to having the advantage in a room look different when they have lost it. The composure was still there, but it was doing more work than usual, the way paint looks on a wall when the structure underneath has begun to shift. She said, "Can we talk?" I stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind me, so the inside of my life stayed inside. She started with the version that cost her nothing, which was the one where she was also a grieving widow who had lost the person she loved and did not deserve to be turned out of her home. She said home the way people say it when they mean a specific accumulated thing. The years of living somewhere, the marks on the door frames, the particular way the light moves through the kitchen in winter. I understood that. I was not without sympathy for the experience of losing a home, because I had nearly lost one and I knew what it was to sit in a driveway with a box of costume jewelry where the ring should have been. But the home she was describing and the home I was thinking of were not the same place. Mine was the home where my mother had lived. The kitchen where my father had made dinner for 3 years alone after she died. The house he had bought in 1989, before Renata, before any of this, paid off himself, maintained by hand, loved for 3 decades, and left to me on purpose. These were not incidental details, they were what the house was. She got more specific. She said she intended to dispute some items on the estate list. She said dispute the way people say it when they want you to know the argument has not ended. She said she had receipts for some of the jewelry pieces. She did not have receipts. I knew this, and she may have known I knew it. She said she did not want this to get uglier than it needed to be. I said, "Renata, I know what you took from that safe. My father knew too. He listed it. The estate list is accurate. You have 60 days. She looked at me, and her eyes did something I had not expected and have thought about many times since. They went, for one short second, to something that was not composure and not anger. Something that looked almost like regret. Not for the jewelry or the will or any of it. For a different thing. For the 16 years of dinners and holidays and the ordinary days before and after he was sick, when she had been in the room with a man she had loved in her way, which was not a good way but was hers. She had lost something real. She had lost it the way people lose things when they spend years treating them as resources, by using them up. And for 1 second, standing on my step, I could see that she knew it. Then she said, "He would not have wanted you to do this to me." And the second was over. I said, "He wrote me a letter. I know what he wanted." And I said it gently, because the regret I had seen in that 1 second was real, and I did not need to be cruel to someone who was already in the room with the thing they had made of themselves. I went inside and I closed the door. The probate closed in February. The house transferred to the trust on a Tuesday morning. Gerald called and said it in the careful language of a man who had done this work for 40 years and still understood that some transfers were more than legal documents. He said, "Your father was a thorough man, Delia. I've managed a lot of estates. This was thorough." I drove to the house that afternoon. Renata had vacated on the 44th day of the 60-day period. I later learned she had moved into an apartment in a town 40 minutes away and that Kyle had helped her with the move. I was glad she had someone. The house was clean. I had expected some sign of anger in it, some small damage, some rearrangement that would tell me what she had felt on her way out. But it was clean. The kitchen was the kitchen. The hallway was the hallway. The workshop light was off, which was the first thing I checked. I walked through every room. The dining table where I had done homework in the evenings. The back bedroom with the window that faced the yard where there had always been a bird feeder. The bathroom with the hex tile floor my father had laid himself in 1994 and that had not shifted once in 30 years. I walked through all of it the way you walk through a place that has been part of you so long, the building knows the sound of your footsteps. On the workbench in the workshop, Propped between the coffee tins was a small envelope I had not seen the day I found the safe. I had taken the two main envelopes and missed this one in the dim light of that November afternoon. It had my name on the front in my father's hand. Inside was a card. The kind you find near the register at a hardware store, plain, with a simple house on the front. Inside, in his handwriting, Delia. It's yours. It was always meant to be yours. Now take care of it the way you take care of things. Like I taught you, Dad. I sat on the workshop stool with that card and I did not move for a long time. The workshop smelled like sawdust and machine oil and cold concrete and him. I sat there until the afternoon light came through the small window and crossed the maple workbench surface the way it had crossed it every afternoon for 30 years, falling at the same angle, the same slow sweep. The way light falls on things that do not move. I thought about what Walt had said, that my father had known what she was going to do and had decided the thing that mattered was not stopping her but making sure it did not work. I thought about a man who had spent his whole career thinking about what was underneath, what a structure required, what would hold under pressure, what would last. I thought about a workshop safe behind a wooden panel and a brass key in a red coffee tin, and a combination embedded in a sentence in a book he had given me 15 years before he needed me to read it that way. He had built something for me that Renata had not known to look for. He had built it the way he built everything. Quietly, precisely, without announcement, and he had put the most important part somewhere she would never think to look, because she had spent 16 years in that house and had never once asked him to teach her how to do anything. She had never come to the workshop. I looked at the red tin on the shelf, third from the left, slightly dented. I looked at the brass key inside it. And I thought, he knew I would ask. He knew I would ask when I was 11, and he would say what he said, and I would put it in a drawer in my mind and leave it there until the day I needed to know what he meant. I picked up a pencil from the cup on the workbench. He had always kept pencils in a cup, never pens, and I started a list. Things the workshop needed. Things the house needed. Things I was going to learn. The list I would have started eventually anyway, because the house had always been mine in the way that the things you are built for are yours before you can prove it. The lamp stayed on until dark. I moved in on a Saturday in March. Walt helped. He showed up in the truck without calling ahead, which was the only way he had ever operated, and we carried boxes from the rental in 3 loads. He did not talk much, and neither did I, and that was exactly right. The workshop I left exactly as my father had left it, every tool in its outline on the pegboard. The drafting table in the corner with the green lamp. The coffee tins along the back wall, including the red one, third from the left, still slightly dented, with the brass key inside it. I see no reason to change that. The key did what it was for. The tin did what it was for. They can stay. What I did add to the workshop was a second chair. A plain wooden one, with a cushion tied to the seat, for whoever comes to sit with me when I am working and we need to be in the same room without having to fill the silence. Walt comes on Sunday afternoons. He drinks his coffee and I work on small projects, basic ones, beginner ones. Nothing like what my father built, but mine. He corrects me when I measure wrong and does not make a production of it. I have been measuring better lately. The house is the house. The hex tile in the bathroom has not shifted. The back bedroom has a bird feeder again. Because there had always been one there, and absence is its own kind of statement. In the spring the yard filled with the long golden light my father had always loved, and I sat on the porch in it one evening and understood, in the simple way you sometimes understand things without needing to arrive at them by argument, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. My father built things his whole life, and he believed that what you built said something true about the builder, about how they thought, about what they valued, about who they expected the building to outlast. He was the most careful man Walt Pruitt ever knew, and Walt Pruitt had known a lot of men. And the most careful thing my father ever built was not a house or a cabinet or an addition or a porch. It was a plan that fit precisely around the shape of his daughter and held her when he could no longer be there to do it himself. That is what real family does. It takes care of things for you that you did not know yet needed taking care of. It thinks 3 steps ahead and leaves the answer somewhere you will find it when you are ready. And it trusts you to be ready. Even when you are 11 years old, asking about a key in a coffee tin, and the answer is already on its way to you. That is my story. Here is what I carry from it. One father who planned with the precision of a man who had built things his whole life and understood that the structure underneath was everything. One old friend who drove an old truck and showed up without calling because that was simply how he was. And one brass key on a plain ring in a red coffee tin, third from the left on a maple workbench. That sat there for 20 years waiting for the day I would need to understand what it opened. If someone in your life has been quietly taking care of things on your behalf, tell them today that you see it. Before the only way they have left to reach you is a letter in a safe behind a wooden panel. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who would carry it. Leave one word in the comments, just one, and I will know what you mean. Subscribe. Take care of what you have been given. Take care of the people who are still here. I will see you in the next one.